nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Just a heads up, there will be a quiz Tuesday, either Tuesday and Wednesday or just Wednesday of the week after the retreat, depending on when I can get you the study guides. But either get it to you in two parts, partly today, partly tomorrow, or the whole thing tomorrow. Depending on that, the quiz will be either Tuesday and Wednesday of the week after the retreat, or only on Wednesday. So there will be more after that. Just a heads up on that. All right. So are we missing any today? Yeah, 2. Okay. It's just did not get the word, or is there some other reason? No, don't know. Okay. All right. So if anybody didn't get the word, then we have to make sure that gets fixed. Okay. So we're just getting into this question of the 3 chapters. We talked about it briefly last time, but the Council of Chalcedon had examined these works. Remember, A Profession of Faith by Theodore of Mopsuestia, which he was a heretic, famously. Also other problematic works. And the Council of Chalcedon had examined these 3 works. This is on page 119 of the notes, by the way. And without passing any positive judgment on their theological soundness, had refrained from a condemnation. So the Eutychians dared not openly attack the Council of Chalcedon, but they hoped to gain the same end by enticing Justinian into a condemnation of the 3 chapters. So they're just devious heretics, devious Monophysites. Eutychians, remember, that's what Eutyches was. He was either the first or at least one of the first Monophysites. He held that it was a reaction to Nestorius, who, remember, held that there were 2 persons in Christ, a human and divine person. And though that's a heresy, of course. There's only one person. Christ is, our Lord, is the second person of the Blessed Trinity, who the divine person, having from all eternity the divine nature, who assumed human nature in time. Both of the human and divine natures being united in his person. That is the truth. So the Nestorius saw 2 natures and decided that he in his own mind that there must be 2 persons, and that's heresy. Eutyches went in the other direction and saw only one person and decided there must be only one nature. And so he decided that the human and divine natures must have merged, blended together, melted together somehow, and fused. Imagine two different metals being melted and then blending together and forming some. At the end of it, you take out of a mold a bar of metal of some kind that's neither one or the other, but a mixture of the both, mixture of the 2. That's what Eutyches thought. That's also heresy. That heresy, monophysitism, which comes from the Greek meaning one nature only, was condemned at the Council of Chalcedon, and the Eutychians, the Monophysites, they are they're obstinate. At this point, it's obvious to everybody that to all good Catholics what must be believed, what we in fact believe to this day, obviously. All good Catholics have always in fact believed, unless they've erred in good faith or something. But the Council of Chalcedon defined that, condemned to monophysitism, but these Eutychians they're being devious, and they do not dare, as our author says, they do not dare to positively attack the Council of Chalcedon, but they want to seek to undermine it in some way. And now they're seeking to enlist the help of the emperor by pushing him to get involved in things that he shouldn't be involved in. It's not to say that he should not be involved in any way in matters of faith, but he's overstepping his bounds in issuing his own condemnations of things. It's just outside of his competence to do that on his own. Now that is the domain of the church. First and foremost, matters of faith are the domain of the church. And yet, the emperor should very definitely be involved, but he should not be taking actions on his own without the authorization of the church. The church would not authorize him to do it on his own. The church would make such, the Pope would either make such pronouncements himself or authorize a council to do it or something. He would not just have the emperor do it on his own. So, They are these devious heretics, obstinate Monophysites, are seeking to undermine the Council of Chalcedon by enlisting the help of the civil power. And this is not the last instance that we'll see in the history of the church of heretics in some way enlisting the help of the civil power to bring about their own ends. Very famously, later on, Martin Luther would do the same. He would butter up the various German princes, who were the ones who, despite the theory that the Holy Roman Emperor was in charge of all Germany, in practice, the emperor had very little power as emperor, very little ability to enact what he wanted, because Emperor Charles V would certainly not have allowed Martin Luther to survive, to go unpunished, we'll say anyway. He probably would have put him to death as an obstinate heretic, but he couldn't, because the German princes, the local princes, who were the ones who actually held power, they were effectively independent. They could defy the emperor pretty much at will with little to no consequence. They liked Luther because of what he was telling them, various different things. For example, that you can steal the property of the church, one thing that he told them that they liked. Other things too. In fact, we won't get too much into that. It's very interesting, but we won't get too much into it. But the point is, this is a typical tactic of heretics, to enlist the help of the civil power to cause the church trouble. So, the Eutychians tried to entice Justinian into a condemnation of the 3 chapters. So Justinian fell into the snare and published a new edict, which he called the Imperial Profession of Faith against the 3 chapters, and addressed to the whole Catholic world. So consider the audacity of that. He's not only making pronouncements on matters of faith for the purpose of providing for the good of his own realm. That would be one thing. I mean, that would be already too much, that if he were to make such pronouncements on his own authority, even if that were for the motives of providing for the peace and safety of his own realm, that would already be too far. Now he's addressing the entire Catholic world as though he were the Pope or something. That is far, far beyond anything he should be doing. So he closed with the following 3 anathemas. If anyone defends Theodore of Mopsuestia, let him be anathema. If anyone defends the writings of Theodoret, let him be anathema. If anyone defends the impious letter of the Bishop Ebas to the Persian Maris, let him be anathema. And keep in mind, anathema, when you see that word, that statement, let him be anathema, anathema sit in Latin, or anathema actually comes from Greek, but it's used in Latin. And you see that anathema sit in a definition of the church, that is a solemn definition. That error is the error being condemned with the anathema is that means that the contrary, the statement that is the contrary of the condemned statement, the statement condemned with the anathema, is in fact de fide. So that's generally true. Whenever the church condemns an error, with whatever degree of severity, the contrary proposition, which is actually the truth, must be believed with the same degree of assent as the severity of the severity of the condemnation, the severity of the censure leveled against it. So, in other words, an anathema demands the contrary proposition to a statement condemned with an anathema demands dissent de fide. That is a dogma that is now explicitly defined de fide. Keep in mind there is such a thing as a dogma that is not defined. It's de fide, but it's not defined. It's one that's taught by the universal ordinary magisterium, but has never been soundly defined. When an error is condemned with an anathema, that means that the contrary proposition is the truth, is contained in divine revelation, and must be believed as a dogma explicitly defined and is de fide. So that is, he's here taking it upon himself to use the language employed by the church in the very strictest of condemnations, and the very highest of definitions. That is the audacity that he's undertaking here, the audacity of his undertaking here. Most of the Catholic bishops of the East were forced, in some sense anyway, to sign Justinian's theological edict. Nobody can be forced, obviously, to give his internal assent to something. That means that they were weak enough to go along with this. but all the emperor's endeavors to win Vigilius to his cause met with a courageous resistance from the pontiff. Remember, Pope Vigilius started out as no prize. He started out as an anti-pope, actually, who became pope eventually just because imperial pressure made it, let's say, at least in the estimation of enough people, inadvisable to carry out a conclave to elect someone they might actually have wanted. That's Pope Vigilius, that's whose reign we're considering. No prize by any means, came into power, so to speak, actually came into power. Went from being anti-pope to being the actual vicar of Christ on earth under circumstances that were less than ideal. Still, at this point, he is clearly a true pope, and he's clearly carrying out the functions of the papacy. And he underwent a kind of transformation, becoming pope. It's not be the last instance of this in the history of the church either. Someone whose life, we'll get to it later on, but in the time of the Renaissance, there was at least one pope whose life prior to becoming pope was less than exemplary, but who after becoming pope was actually very good. So, graces of state are in fact available to those who actually come into a position that merits, to which the divine providence grants those graces. And those graces can transform people. So, you'd think that someone who became pope because of imperial pressure would be an imperial puppet. Most definitely not. Pope Vigilius, definitely not. He, in fact, courageously resists all the pressures of the emperor to go along with this. So, is not the condemnation of the 3 chapters, said Vigilius, an indirect attack upon the Council of Chalcedon, which withheld its censure? He then expressed his wish that 3 chapters should be canonically examined, that they might then, if proper, be lawfully condemned. So he's not saying that these are actually good, that these documents, the 3 chapters, should actually not be condemned, but he is saying that this is not for the emperor to do. It's not for the civil power. So Justinian treated the subject with an ardor which degenerated into passion. So he's losing all reasonableness in how the emperor is losing all reasonableness in how he deals with this. He had obliged Menas, Patriarch of Constantinople, to head the signatures to the imperial profession of faith. Stephen, deacon and legate of the Roman Church, sharply upbraided Menas for his weakness and declared him cut off from his communion. Meanwhile, Justinian excommunicated him. Meanwhile, Justinian was using all his influence to bring the Pope to Constantinople, that he might settle the dispute on the very spot where it arose. And now look at this, this, I might say, condescension, or this concession. Pope Vigilius consented and entered the eastern capital in the month of February of 547. Remember how that went last time. Last time a pope was brought to Constantinople, that didn't end well. That's quite courageous to do, as well as a tremendous concession. He actually agreed to come to that. He could just say, I'm staying in Rome, do what I say. And he could do that. It's well within the power of the Pope to do that, obviously. Nobody can demand that the Pope go anywhere or do anything. At the most, it can be requested. Anybody who makes such a demand is demanding something he has no authority to demand whatsoever. So, Pope Vigilius' first act was to ratify the sentence pronounced against the Patriarch Menas, and to publish a decree of excommunication against the Eutychians and their adherents. So, monophysitism and its adherents condemned yet again. The Pope then proceeded to a canonical examination of the 3 chapters and a council of 70 bishops held at Constantinople. The examination revealed several serious errors in the disputed works, and after mature deliberation, Vigilius condemned the 3 chapters in a sentence which he styled judicatum, judgment, saving, however, the authority of the Council of Chalcedon. So keep in mind here that we're talking about what was not condemned in the Council of Chalcedon. Just because something is put before a council and examined and the council doesn't condemn it, doesn't mean that that is something approved of. Of course, it is actually defined, but it was not, obviously. Nothing was defined concerning these one way or the other. It was something that was perhaps reviewed and then just set aside and not revisited. You could argue that maybe they should have been condemned, or whatever. Still, nobody can compel the Pope to make a council define something or condemn anything. If a council does define or condemn something with the authority or being authorized to do so by the Holy See, then that most definitely holds. But it's done with the authority of the Pope, but nobody can enforce that. And so what exactly is defined or condemned is a matter of prudence. The Pope can decide to condemn or not condemn something as he sees fit. Now you might argue after the fact, was it prudent or not prudent to do this or that? It doesn't matter, in a sense. All we have to do, all anybody has to do, is just submit to that. Submit to what was condemned or defined. And defer to the judgment of the Holy See with regard to the prudence of it. But there are on both sides minds influenced by the spirit of contention. The opponents of the 3 chapters called for a clear and positive condemnation without any restriction or reserve. Their supporters, on the other hand, were naturally much irritated. The latter party was very numerous and counted in its ranks the bishops of Africa, so Algeria and Dalmatia. So Algeria is part of Africa, so I'm not quite sure why he's making a distinction there. But anyway, bishops from different places. The 2 deacons hitherto attached to the person of the sovereign pontiff, and who had accompanied him to the east, now deserted him, and spread the, the report in the provinces that Vigilius had abandoned the Council of Chalcedon, which is false. Just because he's condemning something that was reviewed by the council and not condemned, then is no rebuke to the council. At least does not retract anything that it enacted. The Pope can add to anything enacted by even an ecumenical council whenever he sees fit. Or he cannot repeal any definition, though, because that is defined dogma of faith. And he is bound by that definition, even if he enacts it himself. He authorizes it, which was not the case here. But even if that were the case, he would not be able to repeal it. So he's making no attempt to do that, despite what rumors these turncoats are spreading about him. So Aurelius, Bishop of Arles, who had been appointed by Vigilius legate of the Holy See, receiving this notice, wrote to the Pope to obtain reliable information on the subject. Vigilius replied that he had done nothing against the decrees of his predecessors, nor against the 4 councils. So, he might be saying, the most he could possibly be saying about any previous council is that it should have condemned these things, but didn't. But that's a far cry from saying that they got anything wrong. So we're saying, I'm not making, and even that, it seems he did not even intend that either. Just this is causing trouble. People are kicking up a fuss over these 3 chapters. Let's look at them. Should they actually be condemned? Look at them and say, oh yes, there are in fact errors there. This was submitted to the Council of Chalcedon, which didn't see fit to pronounce upon it for whatever reason. We're looking at it now. Okay, yes, now these should be the errors in these works. I'm not saying that every word, every syllable in those works was wrong, but there are errors, and those errors are deserving of condemnation, and so now they're condemned. In itself, there's nothing wrong with that at all. This is in fact that's perfectly normal. Now, something that might be passed over by a council for whatever reason, it might be for as simple a reason as just a lack of time, that the bishops for whatever reason had urgent need to go back to their dioceses, and there just wasn't time enough to consider everything submitted to the council. It could just be something as simple as that. This is nothing against any previous council, just adding to it. That's all. But for whatever reason, people took it this way, and so now the Pope is trying to dispel that. So this is just a sign that certainly the Pope can do what he wants. Anything that falls within his jurisdiction, he can do whenever he wants, and nobody can stop him. But it might have unintended consequences. So it does not guarantee that we're not saying this was imprudent here. We'll look at the consequences of it. But just this is a note that it might not have ideal effects in the practical order. That can happen. People could get upset about it for any number of reasons, and trouble could ensue from something that the Pope is entirely capable of doing. So, In your position, then, he added, as vicar of the Holy See, warn all the bishops to give no heed to the false letters or reports that may reach them. Let them be assured that we hold to the faith of our fathers. As soon as the emperor has dismissed us, we shall send you someone to give you a full account of our whole conduct. This we have hitherto been unable to do, both on account of the obstructions to travel in the winter season and of the state of Italy wasted by war. Remember that there have been Belisarius had invaded Italy, being sent by Justinian to do so, had fought wars with the Goths up and down Italy. It was a war-torn place at the time. Certainly that. Now, we passed over all the military details of that. It's very interesting if you're so inclined to study the military career of the general who's known as, at least by some, as the last Roman. It's very interesting. But it's not our focus here. So the point being, just for the moment, that indeed to call Italy a place wasted by war was most definitely true at this time. So Vigilius at the same time wrote to Valentinian, Bishop of Scythia, energetically refuting the slanderous charges brought against him. Thus, the Pope's Judicatum did not produce the effect that might have been looked for. So, this is also not uncommon in the history of the Church, unfortunately, that someone might be, that some Pope might, or council might address errors that have truly arisen and need to be dealt with, but instead of solving everything, instead of bringing about peace, due to the obstinacy of heretics in question, in fact, instead of peace, more trouble is brought about. Not unheard of, unfortunately. The Western Catholics thought the honor of the Council of Chalcedon compromised and felt great mistrust. The Eutychians, on the other hand, urged Vigilius to a plain and positive condemnation of the 3 chapters without reference to the Council of Chalcedon, with the hope of creating a perception of undermining, that the Council of Chalcedon has been undermined or perhaps repudiated. That's the impression that they're hoping to bring about. So the Pope thought that this stormy debate would be promptly and decisively settled by calling an ecumenical council whose authority, admitted on all hands, would do away with all possibility of recrimination. Let the Latin bishops, said the Pope to Justinian, who see a stumbling block in the condemnation of the 3 chapters, come to the council, or at least to leave them free to give their opinion and cease this division in the Church of God. But the Eutychians used all their influence to thwart a measure which must prove so ruinous to their hopes. Theodore of Caesarea, their leader, in contempt of the Pope's orders, removed the names of the Catholic bishops from the diptychs and substituted in their places those of the entreated heretics. Notice how serious a thing that is. The right names must be on the diptychs. If you don't have the right names on the diptychs, and if you have the wrong ones, then you have serious problems. This is something that people might tend not to understand, especially talking about the diptychs. Those are the names those were the places in which the names of those to be mentioned in the sacred liturgy were written. And so, whose names are written in the diptychs, their names were pronounced during the sacred liturgy, the Mass itself, as being those who held authority in the Church. And of course, that brings to mind unicum, the unicum phrase, whose name is in the unicum phrase in the Mass, if any at all. That is a very serious consideration. And it's serious. Many people think, it's just mentioning the name. Or it's just praying for the person whose name is mentioned there. It's much more than that. It's just some authors might take it to be a praying for the Pope, but it's praying for that man as Pope. If so, that may not be the only opinion. Authors might debate that, but it's praying for the man as Pope. Even if you just put it that, you would just take that version of it, take it that way. That's taking it as praying for a particular man as Pope, acknowledging that, therefore, implicitly, necessarily holding that the faith that the religion that he teaches is the Catholic faith. And if that's not true, then that is a very serious profession of error. Because remember that the offering of the Mass is not something that is done, I might say, being divorced from the Church. The offering of the Mass is an act of the entire Church. That is extremely important, that not be attempted outside of the Church. So why, objectively speaking, for schismatics to offer the Mass, even when they do so validly, is objectively gravely sinful, very gravely sinful, because that is to be an act of the entire Church, and therefore must be in union with the hierarchy of the Church. And to do it outside of that is a seriously problematic situation to be in. It is gravely sinful to offer the Mass separated from the hierarchy of the Church, or to be involved in the offering of the Mass separated from the hierarchy of the Church. So the diptychs has always been clearly of supreme importance in the history of the Church. So after this open outrage, Vigilius declared that he would no longer hold communion with the Orientals and refused henceforth to admit them to his presence. So they're going back into schism, in other words. So, and this is still centuries before Photius appeared. Long time before. It's no surprise that the Greeks went into permanent schism later on. So this apostolic firmness so enraged the emperor that the Pope was driven to seek shelter in the Church of St. Peter. Justinian determined to take him by force and sent a praetor to surround the basilica with a troop of soldiery. So we've heard stories like this before. Constantinople now gave to the world a spectacle of savage fury, which the barbarian conquerors had spared downtrodden Rome. The praetor ordered the troops to enter the church with drawn swords. At their approach, the Pope took refuge under the altar and clung to the columns which supported it. The praetor caused the deacons and other clerics to be dragged by the hair down from the altar. Then, in their desire to tear away the pontiff himself, his minions seized Vigilius, some by the beard, others by the hair. No, exclaimed the Pope, that though you hold us captive, you cannot hold St. Peter. As he did not yield to their violence, some of the pillars to which he clung were broken. This is a very ugly scene, to say the least. At the sight of such unparalleled brutality, cries of indignation burst from the people and even from some of the soldiers, when the praetor, fearing a sedition, thought it prudent to withdraw his force. So that at least was good, that the travesty was put an end to, if nothing else, because they feared that those who were perpetrating it feared that they might actually themselves be killed by those who were outraged by the travesty they were perpetrating. For the sake of Justinian's reputation, it is to be regretted that, so Varus likes Justinian, for the sake of Justinian's reputation, it is to be regretted that such acts cannot be attributed to the influence of Theodora, but she had died 2 years before, still under the excommunication pronounced by Vigilius against the Eutychians. So this cannot be attributed to any evil influence, which would be bad enough. This was Justinian himself, who, despite whatever good things he may have done, was responsible for this. That cannot be denied. So the emperor tried to win by craft what he could not extort by violence, but Vigilius was on his guard. He succeeded in thwarting all the attempts made against him, and feeling unsafe in the Basilica of St. Peter, even in Constantinople itself, he left the city and took refuge in the Church of St. Euphemia at Chalcedon. Thus, after a sojourn of 7 years in the East, the Pope found himself obliged to contend for liberty and life against the emperor. Justinian's obstinacy was at length overcome by this steady resistance. He made the offer himself to assemble the ecumenical council for which the Catholics had been so long calling. This council, the Fifth Ecumenical, was opened at Constantinople on the 4th day of May of 553 AD. So we just had the anniversary of that, just 9 days ago. 165 bishops were present. The East was represented by a considerable majority. The Pope was justly solicitous lest the Western bishops should not think themselves sufficiently represented in a general council. So keep in mind that an ecumenical council, ideally, is one at which the entire church is to be represented. And we say ideally because the Pope can give the authority of an ecumenical council to any council. But the idea of an ecumenical council is that one is, at least from the beginning, supposed to be an ecumenical council, is that the entire church is supposed to be represented. So this numerical disadvantage of the Western bishops was no new feature in the history of the church since it was passed over. So as far as making definitions, it's not an issue. The Pope authorizes it. He can give it any authority. He can give it any authority he wants. Just a question of prudence, making sure nobody gets upset. That can give rise to schisms. You don't want that. I mean, you see that constantly. The end that the church has in mind is the good of souls. Constantly. And the church might, even the highest level of authority, the Pope himself might refrain from doing various things that he could do that, absolutely speaking, are well within his power to do. He might refrain from doing those things or follow certain guidelines. We say guidelines because he's not bound by any rules. He's never bound at all to call an ecumenical council, but he might follow certain guidelines according to the dictates of prudence for the sake of the good of souls, because the good of souls may in fact be provided for better due to following certain guidelines that for the Pope himself, are nothing more than guidelines. So, in the Eighth Council or Conference, the 3 chapters were condemned in nearly the same terms used by Pope Vigilius in his Judicatum. With a prudence worthy of the supreme head of the Church, the Pope would not promulgate this final judgment until full time had been allowed for truth to make its way into all minds. Many Western Catholics deemed it rash to condemn those whom the Council of Chalcedon had refused to anathematize, on the principle that the Church does not anathematize the dead. But as soon as the Church does not anathematize the dead, what it's referring to here is condemning those who personally held the errors. The Church can condemn any error at any time. But the idea is if someone's died, if he was not anathematized, not given the opportunity to repent while alive, he's not going to be personally anathematized while dead. But as soon as heretics revived the errors of these departed authors to harass the consciences of the faithful, the reserve maintained by the Council of Chalcedon, far from showing propriety, was even dangerous, and it became a matter of urgent necessity to pronounce judgment. So yeah, you could say that, perhaps in hindsight, at the very least, that the Council of Chalcedon was, let's say, the decisions made by the fathers of the Council of Chalcedon was maybe not all of them anyway were of the greatest prudence, because it gave rise to this trouble later on. But yeah, that does not mean that anything they positively pronounced was wrong, which is the impression that the Eutychians were hoping to create. So these reasons gradually gained ground in the public mind, and some months after the Council of Constantinople, Vigilius announced to the Catholic world that the 3 chapters had been regularly condemned. Some historians affect to view this reserve, or pretend to view this reserve and prudence on the part of the Pope as a serious mistake on the question of dogma. So they tried to create that false impression, to view this in such a way. Vigilius had indeed protested at the opening of the council against the emperor's want of honesty in not awaiting the arrival of the Latin bishops. He clearly and energetically showed that such a proceeding was utterly wanting in justice, dignity, and respect for the Church. This protest served only to irritate Justinian, and the Pope was sent into exile. It was mournful to see the head of Christendom thus exposed to the pursuits of the Greek Church. So at this time, there's not an official schism, but they're going back into it. So at this point, we're talking about the Greeks, the Greek section of the Church, you might say. Exposed to the pursuits of the Greek Church, you can see why it would go from being the Greek Church, meaning the section of the Church composed of Greeks, to being a Greek schismatic sect. Those people would go from composing that part of the Church to composing a schismatic sect. So it was mournful to see the head of Christendom exposed to the pursuits of the Greeks, you might say in this case, defenseless, bereft of counsel and consolation, open to the attacks of all parties. In this critical juncture, Vigilius hurries along, prejudges nothing, awaiting the moment. When a calm shall come over the minds of all, he then ratifies, by his pontifical decision, the sentence of the very council whose deliberations he would have delayed until the coming of the Western bishops. So it seems he's dealing with a very difficult situation, and it can be easy to judge decisions like this with the benefit of hindsight, but it seems nobody, I don't know if anybody could have done better under these circumstances. Clearly very trying circumstances. So thus the council became ecumenical, its decisions and laws bind the whole Church. So once again, if the Pope decides that is to be the case, then that's how it is. The succeeding pontiffs confirmed the sentence pronounced against the 3 chapters, and the truth thus breaks through the clouds which had so long hidden it from sight. The debate on the 3 chapters has been so long and so intricate only because the question concerning their authors was involved in that of the works themselves. Passion was rife on both sides, for or against the memory of holy men who might have erred in good faith, but whose life was beyond imputation. So that can happen. that someone might be maybe in good err in good faith, maybe have a very good reputation while alive, but whose errors have to be condemned after he dies. So it seems that, for example, Jansenius, who was the one who wrote the book Augustinus, that was, might say, the charter of Jansenism, what seems himself was perhaps in good faith, at any rate, not particularly troublesome to the church himself. He protested in his work that he said, I'm a loyal son of the church, and if I've said anything wrong in this work, then I retract that. I disown any errors. There definitely were errors. But it was never controversial while he himself was alive. It really became problematic after he died. And after he died, his work was, or the errors in his work, those errors were most certainly condemned by the church. And that leads into a whole other consideration, a question of dogmatic facts, which we won't get into at the moment. But that's one example of someone who, well, perhaps erred in good faith, and we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he was sincere in saying that he was a loyal son of the church and wanted to profess no error. And if we give him the benefit of the doubt, we conclude that he was in good faith in professing the errors that he professed. But that doesn't make those errors okay. Now, whether he died in good faith and what the state of his soul is now, that of course we leave that to God to judge. But certainly he did not cause the church much trouble while he was alive, if any at all. Seems he functioned otherwise as just a normal bishop. The Bishop of Ypres he was, in fact, in Belgium, which became may have been famous already, but became much famous in later times in history. All right. According to us here, as a point of view was taken in respect to the authors or to their doctrines, it was at once possible to absolve and to condemn. So perhaps absolve someone from any formal guilt of professing error, but at the same time condemning the errors themselves. That it's possible to distinguish that. If someone is alive, when you say this person, who adheres to this error, if he's adhering to that obstinately, he's also condemned. He falls under the censure of heresy, just as the censure of being a heretic, we might say, just as the proposition the condemned proposition that he adheres to has received the censure of heresy. Then you can say that. But also, if someone's dead, then obviously he can't retract any errors that he may have held while alive. Yeah, it's not the question. The point is, we're not putting the dead on trial. They've already been judged, of course, if they've left this earth. Remember that no sooner can anyone be said to be dead, that his body and soul are separated, than that he is either in heaven, hell, or purgatory. That is the swiftness of divine justice. Unless divine providence has seen fit to raise that person again from the dead, in which case judgment is suspended on that soul, but that's another story. Ordinarily, that doesn't happen. Most people die once and that's it. Some people have died twice. Lazarus, for example, died twice. He was raised from the dead, very famously, in the Gospels, and then died later on. So some people die twice, most people die only once, and those who die only once, as soon as they die, or in the case of those who have died for the final time, whatever that might be, whichever number of death that might be, so to speak, no sooner can they be said to have died than they can be said to also be in heaven, hell, or purgatory. So those who have died have already been judged. And so we're not putting them on trial again. Not putting them, those who on earth are not to put them on trial anymore. Okay. So the Pope gave his whole attention to the single end of separating two questions, so really distinct. He succeeded, but at the cost of personal peace and tranquility, which must remain a glory to his memory, not a reproach. During the pontificate of Vigilius, the Gauls still stood before the world, staunch adherents to the faith. So this is Darras, French author, who's saying this, and that may well be in fact true. There's relatively very little trouble to the church in the West. Notice all this is in the East, all Constantinople amongst the Greeks. The fact of the matter is that just Constantinople has been a source of tremendous, for centuries, even leading up before the final schism, before Photius and then before the even longer lasting schism that occurred centuries later. Yeah, even before all of that, the East was just a source of a massive headache for the church, you can say. So notice very few saints, if any at all, being produced by the East anymore, and just trouble. Even while there were saints, there was trouble. But now it's fewer saints, if any at all, and just trouble. So the incendiary disputes so much agitated in the East did not trouble their peace. In this period, St. Maurus, a disciple of St. Benedict, was laying the foundation of a monastery at St. Blanfoy, probably, in the Diocese of Angers, and St. Aurelian, Bishop of Arles, and vicar to the Holy See, seconded by the liberality of King Childebert, established in his episcopal city a monastery for men and a community of women. So I may have to go through all of the details given here, but we have the Fifth Council of Orleans, a Second Council of Paris, and everything is running at least relatively smoothly. You don't see too many problems. Sure, there are councils happening and there are things to be dealt with, but not with the level of trouble being given by Constantinople. So, Pontificate of Pope Pelagius I. It's an interesting name for a pope, but there you have it. The question of the three chapters, which had disturbed the pontificate of Vigilius, was destined to trouble the election of his successor. It was still feared in the West that the decision of the Fifth General Council of Constantinople might weaken the authority of that of Chalcedon. At least, it cannot objectively do that. But the concern is that that perception might arise, and that might cause trouble. Pelagius, who was elected pope on the 16th day of April in 555, had as deacon of the Roman Church held to the condemnation of the three chapters. This was enough to bring upon him the most atrocious slanders. He was accused of hastening the death of Vigilius by ill usage, whereas the very contrary was the truth. The consolations and care of Pelagius had soothed the last moments of the dying pontiff. Yet these idle reports had been spread amongst the Roman people and threatened for a while to enkindle the flames of sedition. So hostile was the public mind to Pelagius that only two bishops, John of Perugia and Bonus of Ferentino, found sufficient resolution to consecrate him. So very few were willing to do so. So we notice he was, seems elected while a deacon, so another case of a pope who had to be, if that is in fact correct, which seems to be the case, consecrated a bishop and then crowned pope. So the most illustrious and noble members of the clergy and senate refused his communion, so that's a problem, obviously. The patrician Narses, the emperor's commander in Italy, who was, as I recall, sent actually to replace Belisarius at a certain point, advised him to dispel these odious suspicions by a public demonstration. Pelagius followed the advice and ordered a general procession. On reaching the Basilica of St. Peter, he ascended the pulpit, and holding the book of the Gospels and the crucifix above his head, made oath that he had done no hurt to his predecessor. Those who had hitherto entertained doubts now threw them all aside and joined his communion. Pelagius, availing himself of these good dispositions, urged all those present to join him in banishing simony from ecclesiastical ordinations in every degree of the hierarchy. So simony is still a problem. We've talked about what that is. Still a problem. He gave the superintendence of church property to his secretary Valentine, a man fearing God, who secured the restoration of all the gold and silver, vessels, and precious veils taken from the churches. So perhaps simoniacally sold off, which means that, well, for one thing, that those are invalid transactions anyway. A simoniacal transaction is not a true transaction. So that perhaps were, one way or the other, these things have been lost. He's now recovering them. So that's good, obviously. Pelagius devoted the whole of his pontificate of 3 years to root out the last traces of religious dissensions. So some bishops, more vehement than the rest in their support of the three chapters, excommunicated the patrician. The Pope immediately wrote to him, approving his conduct and assuring him that such excommunication was null. So all such things have to be authorized by the Pope himself. Ordinarily, say, a bishop, someone lower, obviously, in the hierarchy of the church than the Pope, excommunicates somebody, then, or that is to be considered valid, unless the Pope, of course, overrules that. It has to be observed, even if it might be, you might argue that it's invalid for some reason, it still has to be observed. The authors are very clear on that excommunications, even if they're unjust, it might be valid, but they're still clearly unjust. It was due to some kind of some complete misunderstanding. It still has to be observed for the good of the church. even if it might be invalid still, that decree has to be observed. Because otherwise anybody could claim, oh, I was excommunicated unjustly. I can just ignore it. Anybody could claim that and continue doing what he's doing despite the excommunication. So that's yet another nail in the coffin of SSPX, that for decades, they, at least their bishops, who exactly was excommunicated or declared excommunicated by JP2 as a result of their 1988 Episcopal consecrations, they protested that for a long time. That is, it was either invalid or unjust, because they essentially didn't deserve that. That this was something necessary they were justified in doing, and so they're not to be. They should be considered excommunicated. As I recall from when I was in SSPX, I remember the argument was that JP2 didn't excommunicate them. He just said they were excommunicated. That due to this canon, the Novus Ordo, which was actually known as the Lefebvre canon, which enacted excommunication, automatic excommunication, as the penalty for consecrating a bishop without a mandate, which is much stricter, by the way, than the 1917 code, which enacts certain penalties for it, but not excommunication. That's much more severe than the 1917 Code of Canon Law. But it was, the fact of the matter is that if the Pope says, you have fallen afoul of this canon and you are now excommunicated because of that, end of story. And that's as simple as that. So if JP2 is actually the Pope, as they proclaim him to be, then they were excommunicated and should not have been functioning. End of story. Or Archbishop Lefebvre, even before that, he was suspended ad divinis from all sacred functions, was the idea, by Paul VI. So he insists that Paul VI is actually Pope, which actually seems he did not. That's actually something that you won't hear much about. But it seems that Archbishop Lefebvre himself was actually privately held that, at least that Paul VI was not a true Pope. What he thought of JP2 is another thing, but at least Paul VI, he said that at least privately. I think it was actually to Father Gay Penn. He said that. He said he's not a real Pope. But it seems that he never said that publicly, as far as anybody knows. But he did lay out, actually, that was, you may remember that from years ago, that Father Cicada made a video in which he put together all the quotes, probably as many as he could possibly find, in which Archbishop Lefebvre laid out all of the logic, according to which you would conclude that the Holy See is vacant. I think he even called it, the title of the video was something like Marcel Lefebvre's Sede Vacantis, something like that. Never made a bit of a splash at the time when he put it out, as you'd expect. But, whatever you might think of the arguments put forward by what arguments Archbishop Lefebvre was using, still, if you just take it at face value, you must conclude the Holy See is vacant. It's not, from what I recall, the quotes were rather, let's say, totalist sounding, but, the conclusion that Paul VI and company are not true popes, which is, of course, he said that he was saying, aiming those things at probably mainly, if not entirely, at Paul VI, then indeed you have to conclude that Paul VI was not a true pope. So, when the Pope declares, if the Pope says you're excommunicated because of this law of the Church, then that is the end of the story. So in this case, though, the Pope is saying, disregard that doesn't count, they're not actually excommunicated, then it is in fact null and void. So it's the Pope who decides all these things, and there was no appeal from his decision. Not to anybody else currently alive, not to any future Pope or any future council or anything. The Vicar of Christ on earth says it, so it is. Of course, when we're talking about matters of faith and morals, matters of church discipline, which certainly all is entirely within the sphere, without any doubt whatsoever, entirely within the sphere of the jurisdiction of the Pope, who of course has the plenitude of jurisdiction of over all such things everywhere in the Church. At all times. Nobody can limit that. So the Tuscan bishops showed a particular degree of obstinacy in rejecting the condemnation of the three chapters. So that's problematic, and wrote to the Pope with a view to justify their schism. Pelagius replied in a strain of tender and fatherly affection, how can you persuade yourselves that you are not separated from the communion of the, something is wrong here, whole world by breaking with us, in other words, with the entire Catholic world, who are, of course, all in communion with the Pope? How can you persuade yourself that you are not separated from the communion of the whole world by breaking with us, since, in spite of our unworthiness, the authority of the Apostolic See is now vested in our person? Our faith is that of Nice, explained and confirmed by the councils of Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon. If after this declaration any one of you still entertains a doubt, let him come to receive the definition of the doctrine from our own lips, and that thus, knowing the truth, he may join us in communion with the universal church. So, well, and therefore today, looking to wrap things up here for the year, but something like this is worth it. The question of the 3 chapters is definitely worth covering in detail. Something that you won't hear it too much. People don't bring up too many objections in this regard, but it is. Darius is giving us. We might go into some more of the details of this later, having seen this is a relatively simplified version of the whole thing. But when you actually look at all of the particulars, it's actually very complicated. So if you've taken the De Ecclesia course, you may remember the section in which De Groot goes through all of the details of it. He explains it himself from a much more technical perspective than what we're looking at here. So we might go over that, and might bring in some quotes of De Groot just to show how complicated the whole thing was. It boils down to what we've said here, and here is presented very simply, which is good for a historical account, but from as far as apologetical purposes go, you might look at it in a little more detail. Okay. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Subtuum presidium confugimus Sancta Rei Genitrix, nostra simplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus, sera periculis punctis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Amen. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.